Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Manchester by the Sea. Really, this film is about loss and the emotional toll of losing someone and the effect that death has on people, but also kind of the natural effect that death has on people, from dealing with the funeral home to figuring out what to do with the will, and the effects of dealing with a dead family member can have on your life, not just emotionally but just financially, how it can change things, how you can be moving because of it, just because you're certainly mourning that life is moving all around you. There's no kind of these perfect picturesque, mournful moments in this. There's always something kind of interrupting the mourning, whether it be a point where a big emotional scene's happening and then they can't get the gurney into the ambulance, or that there's a big funeral scene and then a baby's crying, or that there's a major scene where Casey Affleck's character is telling this kid that his dad died and it's from far away and at a hockey practice, and they sort of don't stop the hockey practice. It has this kind of theme going throughout it, but that's kind of what Manchester by the Sea does really well, is it kind of shows its naturalistic side, kind of not an incredibly different kind of story. It's very kind of Hollywood kind of feeling, very Oscar-y, but it's not necessarily what this story is. It's what Kenneth Lonergan does with this kind of a story, giving it more of a naturalistic kind of human approach, showing the complications of loss and death and mourning and how that really plays out in life versus how you imagine it would play out when you're thinking about something, but when you're really in it, you see the various things that have gone on before, how loss can transform you as a person in the future. It's much more of a complicated view of that in a very naturalistic style, which makes Manchester by the Sea both very heartwarming and interesting at the same time, which was quite surprising, frankly, because it feels like a film that's just going to play on your emotions and be sort of important and shit, where I think Manchester by the Sea kind of makes an interesting point about humanity and loss, and how we can never really expect that happening, how life's always going to move on and do what it wants, whether we're having loss go on or not. A man named Lee, played by Casey Affleck, who's the janitor working in Quincy. He's kind of the maintenance guy for about 4 different apartment complexes. Then he suddenly realized that his brother Joe has had a heart attack and has gone to the hospital and is in bad shape. So he drives out to see his brother, who's played by Kyle Chandler. His brother has died and he needs to take care of the estate and tell his son Patrick what's happened, and finds out that he is actually going to be in charge of Patrick and needs to figure out what he's going to do with his brother's estate and whether or not he's going to move back to Quincy, Massachusetts from the town that he grew up in, whether he wants to stay there after he doesn't really want to stay there because of his past, and what exactly he wants to do with his nephew. I was kind of surprised by the flow of this film and how it plays out. It feels a lot more indie-ish than I really expected, especially for a big awards push kind of movie. You don't think it to be as indie and kind of arty and quiet, especially at the beginning, as Manchester by the Sea is. I noticed a lot of audience members had kind of a problem with that, especially after the beginning part when it would bring it back as well. They were just kind of shocked by it. I actually quite liked it, and I think a lot of that has to do with the lead of this film, Casey Affleck. I don't know this director at all. I actually haven't seen a Kenneth Lonergan film before. He's kind of one of my cinematic oversights. I've seen this one, but I haven't seen Margaret or You Can Count on Me, which I regret. I think I should have, but this is the first one for me. So I think the flow of how it was filmed was kind of interesting, because you don't see that especially for a big awards movie. Certainly this is a big movie that a studio is pushing, so of course I guess it is an Oscar movie, but it doesn't flow like one, even though it feels like concept-wise it might be one. I found that to be really interesting, actually, and something I quite liked, but it didn't really grab me at the beginning. I liked how it was cut. It felt a little funnier at the beginning. I wasn't sure where it was going to go, and then there's a very powerful scene. They kind of lay out these flashbacks where you kind of understand people's relationships with one another, and you understand why Lee is the way he is, and he's very antisocial. He barely talks. He's angry. He gets in bar fights all the time, and once you understand why he is that way in a very powerful scene, and a scene that actually, although this is a film that you're mostly thinking about, acting and the drama of it and the humanity, it also has a few sequences that are very visual and almost remind me of silent film, particularly of the piano music they have going on throughout it, but some of the visuals and how they play out felt in a much more visual way than I really expected from a movie like Manchester by the Sea, which I found quite refreshing actually. Really struck me. That one scene where I don't want to give anything away, but where you find out what happened to him, I actually cried a little. It was very powerful, and I actually didn't see, I saw a lot of people crying. It was just very striking, and it just like hits you, and then you're so in it. I don't think it let go. The flow of it, I think, confused a lot of people. It took a little while. There's a lot of people talking over one another and not sure how to do the right thing and things of that nature, which is very human. This whole idea that you should have all the answers and things, especially, you having an adult dealing with a teenager, especially when you're younger, you have this idea that to always, correct someone or tell them, this is what they should be doing. Don't you know this? Like they're purposely screwing it up. And then when you're older, you realize, everyone's just trying to do what they can to get by, basically. And kind of having those two ethos meet in a way that, like, an adult who's had all this experience with kids would be able to handle, whereas Casey Affleck is by himself most of the time and doesn't have that experience. So he's having those two butt heads is quite interesting. The arguments and seeing what goes on throughout it, but knowing that history about Casey Affleck kind of deepens your appreciation for him as a character, the character of Lee. And also, I think a lot of this film relies heavily on Casey Affleck and his performance. And I think the whole feel of this movie, I guess they cast him for a specific reason because his kind of portrayal works so well with the flow of this film and how it's made. And while I was watching it, I kept thinking how if they were going to do it with someone else, that would totally change Manchester by the Sea. Like, it's actually like so important in this. I think casting is actually important, but Manchester by the Sea, I think it basically makes the whole movie. It makes the kind of movie it is. And I know this was actually developed to be directed and starring Matt Damon. This is going to be his directorial debut, and ended up not being. He's a producer on this film, and it would have been interesting to see. Apparently there's a little bit where he was going to star in it and Kenneth Lonergan was going to direct it, and then it just became that he's not in it at all and he was going to play the lead character. And I think that would have changed a lot, and it shows how an actor can kind of form around a movie. I think it's probably best that Matt Damon wasn't in this, because I think Casey Affleck gets the kind of like the unableness to talk, the kind of idea of masculinity, that the rigid rules of it, and they're not sure how to communicate. All the guys have problems communicating with one another. They're talking over one another. There's problems with their cell phones. It seems to be a running theme. If Matt Damon had done it, he might have played it up too much in the comedy. I think Casey Affleck plays this very, very well. I still think my favorite performance from him is when he played Robert Ford in The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. That's still, I think, his best performance for me, but I still think he did very, very good performance. I don't know if it's as astronomical as everyone's making it out to be, but I still think it's a very strong performance. It's not very showy at all. That's sort of the point of it. He's very good at playing the comedy in a very natural way for that character that kind of flows in such a way that you're like, whoa, that's weird. It's like an odd comedic timing, that there are moments that like I laughed at that the rest of the audience didn't laugh at, but it's clearly a joke. I'm very curious to see how this is going to play for bigger audiences, because I think there's some people who will get it, some people that won't, and I think it's good to introduce this kind of language that's more used to kind of like indie movies that just play at like IFC Center or people watch on demand in a more bigger setting, and what that could maybe do to film culture, or people just reject it and hate it, which is probably the more likely. I know everyone's really into this movie, and I still think it's good. I think it's kind of one of those Oscar films where I'm like, I don't hate it, I don't love it though. I'm kind of more like, that was fine, and I defend it as like a good movie, and it emotionally hit me. But then there's certain moments that after I watched it, I was like, wait, hold up, what? Like the whole thing with Gretchen Mall's character in this doesn't really work at all. There's nothing wrong with her performance or anything like that, or the part that Matthew Broderick's in, which really took a lot of people out of it. I don't think Matthew Broderick maybe was the right choice, because this film feels so naturalistic, having like an actual movie star in it. That's probably another reason it's good that Matt Damon wasn't in it, because I think Casey Affleck feels more naturalistic, or Michelle Williams, you accept them in this kind of a movie, and Matthew Broderick, a sudden Matthew Broderick, as much like what didn't work in Rules Don't Apply, does not work in Manchester by the Sea either. But the whole thing with his mom, the kid's already dealing with his dad being dead, finding out about his alcoholic mother and things like that, it just didn't really seem to flow within the whole idea of loss and what's going on with his father and everything like that. Couldn't they just say, oh yeah, his mom is gone or died of being gone or drinking, or she's just dead of death. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I don't think it really went to a place that really was helping the story. It just felt like a weird avenue to go into that didn't really pay off as well as I think people might think it did. I noticed it's not being brought up. I haven't really read any reviews where it's being brought up, but I still kind of am questioning, like, that situation seemed awkward, and I think it was played off as well as it probably could have been, but story-wise, just like, where are we even going with Gretchen Mol being in this? I think it would have probably been more interesting to stay on that, and most of the better parts of the movie are more about a relationship and dealing with that, so maybe that's true. I did like Lucas Hedges, who plays Patrick. I think he has probably a really great career ahead of him, very naturalistic. There's certain scenes like him hitting a stick on a fence or crying in front of his uncle, dealing with his girlfriend. They're really good, and he plays so much like a teen. I almost feel like, I didn't look up his IMDb, but if someone had told me like this is his only role, I kind of believe it. He feels like less actor schooly, like less trained, but everything he's doing was very skilled somehow as well. It's actually fairly good. He works for a perfect juxtaposition to Casey Affleck. Michelle Williams really isn't in it that much. I don't know if I love her role necessarily. I think it's kind of a little too small, but she's Michelle Williams and she's always really good and stuff, and she's equally as good in this, but I just don't think it was as astonishing, really. She's always really good and it's still a good performance, but it's not something that's really standing out to me necessarily. I like Manchester by the Sea, but it often feels like an Oscar movie that you'll see on DVD 5 years later. Your passion for it's so gone because you kind of spent it all during the time that this movie's a big deal and you can't really care as much about it. It screams of a movie like that. I think it's directed a lot better than most Oscar movies in that it cares a lot more about these relationships and less hitting these kind of like Oscar-y beats, but it's developed in a way. It was developed by John Krasinski and Matt Damon and then pitched to Kenneth Lonergan, who kind of takes it and really makes it his own. It's interesting. It shows like what a real director or an auteur can do with that kind of an idea. I don't know what Matt Damon would direct like, but a lesser director could not have pulled this off. And I think Kenneth Lonergan can do that, and maybe that's the new idea of what an Oscar prestige movie could be. Now, this was made outside the studio system, even though it was produced by a guy who produced, The Bourne Legacy and is a massive movie star. And how indie really is it? But I think that doesn't much matter. I think what does matter is taking more of an indie director and purposely making a prestige movie. It's kind of an interesting way to go about something like Manchester by the Sea. Its naturalism and its humor really like makes it shine and really can kind of hit you in a lot of ways. It's a very effective motion picture, but I'm not in love with it. I'm not as passionate about it. I kind of feel like the praise for it is like way too much. But I still think it's a very good film and you're not going to be disappointed. You might not care about it in 2 years or the 2 years after, whenever you see this fucking thing, but at the time you see it, it will hit you, it will affect you, and you will be surprised at how it moves and how it flows and how it tells its story. It's a really kind of enriching, kind of naturalistic way to look at loss and death and how a family really deals to that and comes together and picks up the pieces that were left behind. And I think Manchester by the Sea does a magnificent job of doing that. Maybe not as magnificent as everyone's making it out to be, but still a fairly nice one at that. So if you've seen Manchester by the Sea and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.